Blood-matted and trembling with exhaustion, the mother bobcat dragged her 3 newborn cubs into Thomas's barn, her desperate amber eyes meeting his with a silent plea that pierced his drought-hardened heart. What Thomas discovered about this wild creature's impossible journey would forever alter his understanding of survival and transform not just his failing farm, but an entire community ravaged by nature's cruelty. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The fading light of dusk painted long shadows across the rolling farmland of western Nebraska. The unseasonable May heatwave had scorched the landscape for nearly 2 weeks, turning what should have been verdant spring fields into a dusty, parched wasteland. Thomas Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as he walked the perimeter of his property, assessing the damage that nature's cruel hand had dealt his family farm. At 63, the lifetime of working this land had etched deep lines into his weathered face, but the creases that formed at the corners of his eyes as he surveyed his withering crops were different. They were born of worry, not age. The drought had been relentless. Springs that had flowed reliably for generations had slowed to pitiful trickles, then stopped altogether. The creek that divided his property, once a vibrant lifeline teeming with minnows and frogs, had been reduced to a series of disconnected muddy puddles. Thomas hadn't seen such conditions since the brutal summer of '88, when he'd been a young man working alongside his father. Back then, they'd survived through determination and community support. This time, he wasn't sure if either would be enough. A sound stopped him in his tracks, a faint, desperate cry carried on the hot breeze. Thomas cocked his head, listening intently. There it was again, coming from the direction of the old barn that stood near the northern boundary of his property. The structure hadn't been used for anything but storage in years, its weathered red paint peeling to reveal the gray wood beneath, a silent testament to the passage of time. Curious, Thomas changed direction, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. As he approached the barn, the sound grew more distinct, a pitiful mewling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He'd spent enough time in these parts to recognize the cry of a bobcat, but there was something different about this one. Something that spoke of desperation rather than aggression. The massive doors of the barn had warped with age, leaving a gap just wide enough for a determined animal to squeeze through. Thomas pulled his flashlight from his belt and peered inside, the beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, but otherwise the barn appeared empty, filled only with stacked hay bales, old equipment, and the accumulated remnants of decades of farming life. "Hello?" Thomas called out, feeling slightly foolish for addressing a possible wild animal as if it were a neighbor come calling. The mewling stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. He swept the flashlight beam across the dirt floor, looking for tracks. There, near the base of the hay bales, were distinctive paw prints, too large for a house cat, with the telltale absence of claw marks that distinguished feline from canine prints. Thomas moved deeper into the barn, his senses heightened. He'd encountered bobcats before, admired their fierce independence from a distance, but never inside one of his buildings. They were typically shy creatures that avoided human contact at all costs. For one to seek shelter in his barn, something had to be seriously wrong. The sound came again, fainter now, originating from behind a stack of hay in the far corner. Thomas approached cautiously, aware that a cornered wild animal could be dangerous. As he rounded the bales, the beam of his flashlight finally revealed the source of the cries. There, nestled in a makeshift den of straw, lay a female bobcat, her spotted fur matted with dirt and what appeared to be dried blood. Her flanks heaved with labored breathing, and her normally alert eyes were half closed with exhaustion. Beside her, squirming blindly against her belly, were 3 tiny cubs, their eyes still sealed shut, no more than a week old. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. In all his years, He'd never seen anything quite like this. A wild bobcat mother had chosen his barn as a sanctuary to deliver and nurse her young. But as he studied the scene more closely, his wonder gave way to concern. The mother's condition was alarming. She was severely emaciated, her ribs clearly visible beneath her dull coat. A deep gash ran along her left flank, crusted with dirt and partially healed. Despite her obvious weakness, she raised her head at his approach, baring her teeth in a feeble hiss of warning. "Easy there, Mama," Thomas whispered, lowering his flashlight to avoid shining it directly in her sensitive eyes. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bobcat's ears flattened against her skull, but she lacked the strength to do more than that. Thomas noted with growing alarm that despite her aggressive display, she hadn't moved to shield her cubs or to retreat further into the corner. It was as if every ounce of her remaining energy was devoted to this final, desperate act of protection. Thomas backed away slowly, mind racing. The bobcat was clearly in dire straits, too weak to hunt or even move much. Without intervention, both she and her cubs would almost certainly perish. Yet she was a wild animal, not some stray barn cat that could be easily approached and handled. The logical course of action would be to call animal control or the Department of Natural Resources, but Thomas knew what that would likely mean. Euthanasia for the mother if she was too far gone, and a slim chance of survival for the cubs in a wildlife rehabilitation center. Something about the scene struck a deeper chord in Thomas. Perhaps it was the mother's obvious determination to protect her young despite her own suffering, or perhaps it was simply that in this moment of vulnerability, he saw not a wild predator but a fellow living creature fighting against impossible odds. Whatever the reason, Thomas made a decision that would alter the course of not just the bobcats' lives, but his own as well. Back at the farmhouse, Thomas's wife, Eleanor, was stirring a pot of stew on the stove when he burst through the door, his face flushed with urgency. "Ellie," he said, already gathering supplies from the cabinet under the sink, "we've got a situation." Eleanor turned, wooden spoon in hand, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. At 61, she'd been by Thomas's side through every hardship the farm had faced. "What's happened? Another irrigation pump failed?" "No, nothing like that." Thomas pulled out their first aid kit and began rummaging through the refrigerator. "There's a mother bobcat in the old barn. She's got cubs, 3 of them, newborns from the look of it. She's in bad shape, Ellie. Wounded, starving." Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. "A bobcat? Thomas, you're not thinking of—" "She'll die if we don't help her," Thomas interrupted, finding the plastic container of raw chicken he'd been looking for. "And those cubs along with her." "Thomas Miller," Eleanor said firmly, placing the spoon on the counter. "That is a wild animal, a predator, not some stray cat you can just take in." "I know what she is," Thomas replied, his voice softening. "And I'm not suggesting we turn her into a pet. But she came to our barn, Ellie. She brought her babies to our doorstep. Doesn't that mean something?" Eleanor studied her husband's face, recognizing the determination in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had when they'd decided to take in their nephew after his parents' accident. The same expression he wore whenever he encountered something broken that he believed he could fix. "Have you called Wildlife Services?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Thomas shook his head. "You know what they'll say. That mother is too far gone. They'll put her down and take the cubs if the cubs even survive the separation." Eleanor sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "What do you need me to do?" Relief washed over Thomas's face. "Get my old work gloves, the heavy ones, and that small pet carrier we used for Rusty when we took him to the vet. I'll need some towels, clean water, and that electrolyte solution we used for the calves last spring." As Eleanor gathered the requested items, Thomas prepared small pieces of the raw chicken. He knew that in her weakened state, The mother bobcat would need easily digestible protein, and lots of it. He wasn't a veterinarian, but decades of caring for livestock had given him a practical knowledge of animal husbandry that he hoped would be enough. The sun had fully set by the time they returned to the barn, armed with their makeshift emergency kit. Thomas led the way, flashlight in hand, while Eleanor followed with the supplies. As they approached the hay bales, Thomas gestured for Eleanor to stay back. She nodded, understanding the danger a cornered wild animal could pose, especially one protecting its young. "She's just behind there," Thomas whispered, pointing to the stack of hay. "I'm going to try to get some food and water to her first, see if that helps." Eleanor watched as her husband slowly approached the makeshift den, speaking softly as he went. "Hey there, Mama. I brought you something to eat. You and those babies need your strength." From her position, Eleanor couldn't see the bobcat, but she heard a low growl followed by a pitiful mewling sound that tugged at her heart. Thomas knelt, still maintaining a respectful distance, and placed a shallow dish of water and some pieces of chicken on the ground before retreating. "Now we wait," he said, rejoining Eleanor. "Let's give her some space." They retreated to the barn entrance but remained inside, watching from afar. After several tense minutes, they saw movement, the mother bobcat cautiously emerging from her hiding spot. Despite her weakness, there was still a wild grace in her movements, a reminder of the powerful predator she was meant to be. She sniffed at the offerings, her survival instinct warring with her distrust of humans. Finally, hunger won out. She lapped desperately at the water, then devoured the chicken pieces with startling speed. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged hopeful glances. It was a small victory, but an important one. The mother had accepted their help, crossing a crucial threshold. As they watched her return to her cubs, Thomas knew this was just the beginning of what promised to be a challenging journey, one that would test not only his practical skills but also his understanding of the delicate balance between wild and tame, between helping and interfering. What neither of them could have anticipated was how this chance encounter would ripple outward, changing not just their lives but the lives of their entire community, challenging long-held beliefs about coexistence and conservation in ways they never could have imagined. Dawn broke over the Miller farm, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that belied the hardships the land below was enduring. Thomas had spent much of the night in the barn, keeping a respectful distance from the Bobcat family while ensuring the mother had access to fresh water and food. Now, as he made his way back to the house for a quick change of clothes and a fresh pot of coffee, his mind was already racing with plans and concerns. Eleanor met him at the door, her face lined with worry. "You look exhausted. How are they?" "She ate again around 3 in the morning," Thomas replied, accepting the steaming mug his wife offered. "The cubs seem active enough, always squirming and mewling. But that wound on her side concerns me. It's infected, I'm almost certain." Eleanor nodded, her practical nature already assessing the problem. "We need antibiotics then, and proper food, not just leftover chicken." "I've been thinking about that," Thomas said, his voice lowering as if someone might overhear their somewhat illegal plans to rehabilitate a wild predator. "I'm going to call James." James Redtail was the local veterinarian, a Lakota man whose practice primarily served the farmers and ranchers in the area. He and Thomas had developed a friendship over decades of calving seasons, injured horses, and the occasional emergency with one of Eleanor's cherished barn cats. More importantly, James had a deep respect for wildlife and had been known to treat injured wild animals with a don't ask, don't tell approach that sometimes skirted the edges of wildlife regulations. "He'll know what to do," Eleanor agreed. "But Thomas, we need to be realistic about this. Even if we help the mother recover, what then? We can't keep wild bobcats as pets." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "One step at a time, Ellie. First, we make sure they survive. Then we figure out the rest. An hour later, James's dusty pickup rolled up the long driveway. The veterinarian stepped out, medical bag in hand, his dark eyes squinting against the morning sun. At 55, James carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the beginning and end of countless lives and understood the fragile thread that connected them all. "Morning, Thomas," he called, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "Eleanor said you've got an unusual patient for me." Thomas clasped his friend's hand firmly. "Thanks for coming, James. It's not your typical farm call." As they walked toward the barn, Thomas explained the situation in detail, finding the bobcat, her condition, the cubs, and his makeshift efforts to provide food and water. James listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. Only when Thomas had finished did he speak. "You know, keeping a bobcat without proper permits is against state regulations." "I'm not looking to keep her," Thomas replied quickly. "Just to help her get back on her feet, or paws, I suppose, so she and her cubs can return to the wild where they belong." A small smile played at the corners of James's mouth. "Didn't say I wouldn't help. Just making sure you understand what you're getting into." He patted the medical bag at his side. "I brought medications that should work for a felid her size, and some specialized formula for the cubs if she can't nurse properly." Inside the barn, the air was cooler, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated through gaps in the wooden walls. James followed Thomas to the hay bales, his movements deliberately slow and quiet. "She's just behind there," Thomas whispered. "I've been keeping my distance, just pushing food and water within her reach." James nodded, setting his bag down carefully. "Smart. Let me see if I can get a look without stressing her too much." With practiced ease, the veterinarian positioned himself to peer around the hay bales. The mother bobcat was awake, her amber eyes fixing immediately on the newcomer. She growled low in her throat, repositioning herself to shield her cubs, but James noted with professional concern that her movements were sluggish, lacking the quick precision that would normally characterize a healthy bobcat. "She's in rough shape," James confirmed, pulling back to speak quietly to Thomas. "Severe dehydration, infection setting in on that wound, and she's drastically underweight. The drought has probably depleted her natural food sources, and that injury would make hunting nearly impossible." "Can you help her?" Thomas asked, the naked hope in his voice making him sound younger than his years. James considered the situation. "I can give her antibiotics and fluids, a long-acting injection that should help fight the infection. But getting close enough to treat that wound properly would require sedation, and in her weakened state, that's risky." "What about the cubs?" "I'll need to examine them too. Make sure they're hydrated and developing normally. If the mother's milk production is compromised due to her condition, we'll need to supplement with formula." James began preparing a syringe from his bag. "For now, let's start with the medications I can administer from a distance. Then we'll see about getting her to trust us enough for more direct treatment." Over the next hour, Thomas watched in amazement as James worked with the quiet confidence that had made him the most respected veterinarian in 3 counties. Using a pole syringe, he managed to administer antibiotics to the mother bobcat without having to get dangerously close. The bobcat hissed and swiped at the intrusion, but was too weak to mount an effective defense. "That's the first step," James said, packing away the used syringe. "The antibiotics should start working within 24 hours. I've also prepared some specialized high-calorie food that will help her regain strength faster than plain meat alone." He handed Thomas several containers of a meat-based mixture fortified with nutrients. "Offer this 3 times a day in small amounts. Too much at once could make her sick after being starved for so long." Thomas took the containers gratefully. "And the cubs?" "That's going to be more challenging," James admitted. "Ideally, we need to examine them soon, but separating them from the mother could cause her extreme stress. Let's give the antibiotics time to work. See if she becomes more accepting of your presence." As they exited the barn, James placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I have to ask, why are you doing this, Thomas? Most folks would have called wildlife services and been done with it." Thomas was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the drought-ravaged fields that had been his family's livelihood for generations. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "This drought has pushed everything to the edge of survival. The crops, the wildlife, even our way of life here. I've spent the past month watching things wither and die despite my best efforts." He turned to face his friend. "But this I might be able to save. Maybe that's selfish, wanting to feel like I can still make a difference in the face of all this helplessness." James nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. "There's nothing selfish about compassion, my friend. But I will say this, wild things remain wild, no matter how much we may help them. Remember that as you go forward." After James left, Thomas returned to the house to find Eleanor at the kitchen table, a determined expression on her face and her laptop open before her. "I've been researching bobcat rehabilitation," she announced without preamble. "There's a wildlife rehabilitator in Grand Island who specializes in native predators. I've sent her an email explaining our situation." Thomas smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest at his wife's implicit support. "Always one step ahead of me, aren't you?" "Someone has to be," she replied with a hint of humor. Then, more seriously, "James is right, though. We're not equipped to fully rehabilitate a bobcat family. We need expert advice if we're going to do this properly." Thomas nodded, setting the containers of specialized food on the counter. "James said to give the antibiotics time to work before we try anything more involved. For now, we keep her fed, hydrated, and as comfortable as possible." Eleanor closed her laptop and stood. "Well then, let me see this special diet he's prepared. If we're going to nurse a wild bobcat back to health, we might as well do it right." As they worked together, preparing the food according to James's instructions, a notification chimed on Eleanor's laptop, a response to her email, arriving far sooner than expected. The subject line read, Bobcat Rehabilitation Emergency, arriving tomorrow." Things were about to get even more complicated at the Miller farm, though neither Thomas nor Eleanor could have predicted just how far-reaching the consequences of their compassion would become. The following morning, Thomas rose before dawn, his old farmer's habits unbroken despite the sleepless night. He moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake Eleanor, and made his way to the barn with a container of James's special food mixture. The soft golden light of his lantern cast long shadows as he approached the bobcat's makeshift den. "Morning, Mama," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle and even. "Brought you breakfast." To his surprise, the mother bobcat was awake and alert, her amber eyes following his movements with less hostility than before. Though still weak, there was a noticeable improvement in her demeanor. Thomas took this as a positive sign. The antibiotics were beginning to work. He placed the food and fresh water within her reach, then backed away to his now familiar observation spot atop a hay bale several yards away. Over the past day, he'd established this routine, talking quietly to the bobcat family as the mother ate, gradually decreasing the distance between them without ever making her feel cornered or threatened. "Those babies of yours are getting livelier," he commented, noting how the tiny cubs squirmed and mewled, their spotted fur still downy soft in their infancy. "You're doing a good job keeping them fed, considering everything you've been through." The bobcat, of course, didn't respond, but Thomas found comfort in the one-sided conversation. There was something soothing about speaking to this wild creature, who asked nothing of him but food and space, who didn't know about drought subsidies or failing irrigation systems or bank loans coming due. By the time Thomas returned to the house, the sun had fully risen, and Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing a hearty breakfast. The rich aroma of coffee and bacon filled the air, momentarily masking the underlying tension that had become a constant presence in their home since the drought began. "How's our patient?" Eleanor asked, sliding a plate of food in front of him as he sat at the worn kitchen table. "Better, I think. More alert. She didn't hiss at me this morning, which I'm taking as progress." Thomas took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. "What time is this rehabilitator supposed to arrive?" Eleanor glanced at the clock on the wall. Her email said around 10. "She's driving in from Grand Island." She hesitated, then added, "Her name is Dr. Maya Kingsley. According to her website, she's one of the leading experts on Bobcat rehabilitation in the Midwest." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Sounds impressive. Also sounds expensive." "Thomas," Eleanor said, her tone carrying a gentle warning, "we agreed to do this properly. If that means paying for expert help, then that's what we'll do." He nodded, knowing she was right. The Millers weren't wealthy by any means. The farm provided a modest living in good years, and this drought had stretched their finances thin. But some things transcended monetary concerns. The Bobcat family had become one of those things, a symbol of resilience amid devastation that resonated deeply with both of them. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of their visitor. Thomas stepped onto the porch to greet a sleek silver SUV that pulled up beside James's usual parking spot. The vehicle bore the logo of the Midwest Wildlife Recovery Center on its side, lending an official air to their previously clandestine operation. The woman who emerged was not what Thomas had expected. Dr. Maya Kingsley appeared to be in her early 40s, with copper-brown skin and black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore khaki field pants, a navy button-up shirt with the Recovery Center's logo, and hiking boots that had clearly seen many miles of rough terrain. Her movements were quick and efficient as she retrieved equipment from the back of her SUV. "Mr. Miller," she called, approaching with an extended hand, "I'm Dr. Kingsley. Thank you for reaching out about the Bobcat family." Thomas shook her hand, noting her firm grip and direct gaze. "Just Thomas, please, and thank you for coming all this way on such short notice." Eleanor joined them, wiping her hands on a dish towel. After introductions, she led Dr. Kingsley into the house for a quick cup of coffee and a more detailed explanation of the situation before they would head to the barn. "So you found her 2 days ago," Dr. Kingsley confirmed, jotting notes in a small leather-bound book. "And she already had the cubs with her?" "That's right," Thomas nodded. 3 of them, eyes still closed. "Our local vet, James Redtail, came by yesterday and administered antibiotics for an infected wound on her side." Dr. Kingsley looked up sharply. "Dr. James Redtail is your vet?" "I know him by reputation. He's presented at several wildlife medicine conferences. You're fortunate to have him in the area." Eleanor smiled, pleased by the recognition of their friend's expertise. "We've known James for decades. He's been a godsend with this situation." "And you've been providing food and water, but minimal direct contact?" Dr. Kingsley continued, reviewing her notes. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "She seems to be getting more comfortable with our presence, but we've been careful not to push too far too fast." Dr. Kingsley nodded approvingly. "You've done everything right so far. Many people would have tried to handle the cubs immediately, which could have been disastrous." She closed her notebook decisively. "Well, let's go see our patients, shall we?" The barn was cooling rapidly as the day's heat built outside, creating a relatively comfortable environment within its shadowy interior. Dr. Kingsley moved with quiet confidence, carrying a specialized case of equipment. As they approached the Bobcat's den, She motioned for Thomas and Eleanor to hang back slightly while she made her initial assessment. The mother bobcat's reaction to the newcomer was immediate. A low growl rumbled from her throat, and she shifted her body to shield her cubs from view. Dr. Kingsley stopped at a respectful distance, then slowly lowered herself to a sitting position on the ground, making herself appear smaller and less threatening. "Hello, beautiful," she murmured, her voice taking on a rhythmic, soothing quality that seemed to captivate both the bobcat and the Millers. "What a good mother you are, protecting your babies so well." For several minutes, Dr. Kingsley simply sat there, occasionally speaking in that same gentle tone, allowing the bobcat to become accustomed to her presence. Thomas and Eleanor watched in fascination as the standoff gradually eased, the mother's posture becoming less defensive, though still watchful. "She's malnourished, but not critically so," Dr. Kingsley said quietly, speaking now to the Millers without taking her eyes off the bobcat. "The fact that she's still producing milk for 3 cubs is remarkable. James's antibiotics seem to be working on that wound, though it will need further treatment." Slowly, she opened her case and removed what looked like a specialized camera with a long lens. "This is a thermal imaging device. It will let me check her body temperature and that of the cubs without having to handle them just yet." The examination continued in this methodical, non-invasive manner, with Dr. Kingsley explaining each step to both the Millers and, curiously, to the bobcat herself, as if the wild animal could understand the purpose behind these strange human activities. After about an hour, Dr. Kingsley rejoined Thomas and Eleanor at the barn entrance, her expression thoughtful but optimistic. "She's in better shape than I expected, given your description of how you found her," she said. "The antibiotics are working, her hydration is improving, and the cubs appear to be developing normally." However, her tone grew more serious. "She still has a long road to recovery, and those cubs will become more demanding as they grow." "What do you recommend?" Eleanor asked, the practical question underlining their commitment to seeing this through. Dr. Kingsley smiled, seemingly reassured by their dedication. "I'd like to set up a more formal rehabilitation protocol. This will involve a proper feeding schedule, medication management, and eventually, as she heals, a plan for helping her develop the strength and skills she'll need to return to the wild with her cubs." Thomas frowned slightly. Return to the wild? In this drought? That's what nearly killed her in the first place. "I understand your concern," Dr. Kingsley said, nodding. "But bobcats are wild animals with complex needs that can't be fully met in captivity. Our goal has to be rehabilitation and release, though not until both she and her environment can support that successfully." Eleanor touched her husband's arm gently. "She's right, Thomas. We always knew this wasn't about keeping them." Thomas sighed, acknowledging the truth in their words. "So what's the first step in this formal protocol of yours?" "We need to create a more appropriate habitat within the barn," Dr. Kingsley explained, her energy shifting to practical planning. "Something that gives her security and privacy, while still allowing for observation and care. I brought some specialized equipment from the center, but we'll need to adapt the space using what you have available." By late afternoon, the southwest corner of the barn had been transformed. Using wooden pallets, straw bales, and materials from Dr. Kingsley's SUV, they had constructed a sheltered enclosure that provided the bobcat family with a secure den area, separate feeding station, and enough space for limited movement as the mother regained her strength. Cameras with night vision capability were strategically placed to allow for constant monitoring without intrusive human presence. As they finished the setup, a soft chime sounded from Dr. Kingsley's phone. She checked it quickly, her expression shifting from satisfaction to concern. "Everything okay?" Thomas asked, noticing the change. Dr. Kingsley hesitated, then replied, "Actually, there's something I need to discuss with both of you. Let's head back to the house." Seated at the kitchen table with fresh coffee before them, Dr. Kingsley revealed the complications she'd been reluctant to share earlier. "I received a notification from our regional wildlife network," she began. "There have been reports of a dead female bobcat found about 15 miles from here, apparently killed by a vehicle on Highway 26. Based on the tracking collar she was wearing, wildlife officials have identified her as part of a conservation study." "What does that have to do with our bobcat?" Eleanor asked, though the connection was already forming in her mind. Dr. Kingsley met their eyes directly. The bobcat was nursing, but no cubs were found with her. "Considering the timing and location, it's highly possible that the mother you're sheltering isn't the birth mother of these cubs. She may have found them, or perhaps there was a shared den situation, which occasionally happens with female bobcats who are related." The implications of this new information hung in the air between them, adding yet another layer of complexity to what had already become an extraordinary situation. Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing this new information. "So you're saying our bobcat essentially adopted these cubs, took responsibility for them even though they weren't hers?" Dr. Kingsley nodded cautiously. "It's a possibility we need to consider. Adoption isn't common among bobcats, but it does happen, especially among related females, sisters or a mother and daughter sharing a territory. The fact that she was so weakened yet still caring for these cubs rather than abandoning them to save herself suggests a strong bond." Eleanor's eyes shone with unshed tears. "That makes what she did even more remarkable, doesn't it? Carrying those babies all that way when she was already injured and starving, looking for shelter." "If that's indeed what happened," Dr. Kingsley agreed, her professional caution tempering Eleanor's emotion. "We may never know the full story, but it certainly makes her survival all the more important. Those cubs would have no chance without her." Thomas's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his thoughts turning to the practical implications. "Does this change the rehabilitation plan?" "Not fundamentally," Dr. Kingsley replied, "though it might explain her condition beyond just the drought. Caring for cubs that weren't hers initially would put additional strain on an already stressed body." She pulled her laptop from her bag and opened it on the table. "I'd like to show you something." She turned the screen toward them, revealing a map dotted with colored markers. "This is a tracking map of known bobcat territories in this region. The deceased female was here." She pointed to a red marker about 15 miles northeast of their location. Her territory overlapped slightly with another female's range here. Her finger moved to a blue marker closer to the Miller farm. "You think that's our bobcat?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward to study the map. "It's possible. This female was also part of the study but lost her tracking collar about 6 months ago. The researchers have occasionally picked up signs of her presence, but no direct sightings recently." Dr. Kingsley zoomed in on the area around their farm. "What's interesting is that both territories have been severely impacted by the drought. Water sources have dried up, prey animals have migrated or died off. It's created a crisis situation for all wildlife in the region." Thomas rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "So she might have been searching for new territory with better resources when she found the cubs? Or she already knew about your barn as a potential shelter," Dr. Kingsley suggested. "Bobcats have excellent spatial memory. She might have observed your property during hunting excursions, noted the barn as a landmark, and remembered it when she needed refuge." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway. Thomas glanced out the window to see James's pickup returning, right on schedule for the follow-up treatment he'd promised. "Perfect timing," Dr. Kingsley said with a smile. "I'm looking forward to meeting Dr. Redtail properly." The two veterinarians took to each other immediately, their shared passion for wildlife medicine creating an instant rapport. After brief introductions, They moved to the barn to collaborate on the Bobcat's treatment, leaving Thomas and Eleanor at the house to prepare dinner for what had unexpectedly become a team of 4. "Never thought our empty nest would fill up quite like this," Eleanor commented as she sliced vegetables for a stew. With their children grown and scattered across the country, the farmhouse had seemed too large, too quiet in recent years. Now it buzzed with purpose again. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "Strange how things work out, isn't it? A week ago I was wondering if we should sell the farm, move somewhere the rain still falls. Now I can't imagine leaving, at least until we see this through." Eleanor paused her chopping, studying her husband's face. "This means a lot to you, doesn't it? Beyond just helping some wild animals." Thomas was silent for a moment, formulating thoughts he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. "You know what my father used to say about farming? That it's the business of nurturing life against the odds. That drought, flood, pests, market crashes, they're all just challenges to overcome, not reasons to quit." He looked out the window toward the barn. "I guess that Bobcat reminded me of that. Here she is, everything stacked against her, and she's still fighting, still caring for those cubs that might not even be hers. Makes my problems seem a little more manageable somehow." Eleanor reached across the counter to squeeze his hand, understanding the deeper currents beneath his words. The drought hadn't just threatened their livelihood, it had eroded Thomas's sense of purpose, his confidence in the path they'd chosen decades ago. The Bobcat had somehow restored something essential that had begun to wither alongside their crops. The veterinarians returned as the sun was setting, their expressions reflecting cautious optimism. "We've managed to clean and treat the wound properly," James announced as they washed up at the kitchen sink. "She's still wary, but allowed us closer approach than I would have expected at this stage. The cubs are developing well too," Dr. Kingsley added. "Their eyes should open within the next week, and they're gaining weight appropriately. Your feeding program has been exactly what she needed to maintain milk production." Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily among the 4 of them. Technical discussions of Bobcat physiology and behavior interspersed with stories from James and Dr. Kingsley's veterinary experiences. As they were finishing the meal, Dr. Kingsley brought up a new topic. "I've been thinking about your situation here," she began, her tone suggesting she'd been carefully considering her next words. "The recovery center where I work has been at capacity since the drought began. We've had an unprecedented number of animals needing rehabilitation." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances, sensing a proposal coming. "Normally, I would recommend transferring the Bobcat family to our facility, but given the space constraints and the excellent care they're receiving here," she paused, looking between them. "Would you be willing to serve as an official satellite rehabilitation location? It would mean proper documentation, some additional equipment I'd provide, and regular visits from me or my colleagues to monitor progress." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of tires on gravel interrupted once more. This time, the vehicle was unfamiliar, a white pickup truck with the emblem of the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission emblazoned on its door. "Were you expecting someone else?" Dr. Kingsley asked, a note of concern in her voice. Thomas shook his head, rising from his chair. "No, but I'd better go see what they want." The man who stood on their porch wore the uniform of a state wildlife officer, his expression serious beneath the brim of his official cap. "Mr. Miller, I'm Officer Craig Daniels with Game and Parks. We've received information that you might be harboring wildlife without proper permits or authorization. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He was about to respond when Dr. Kingsley appeared beside him, her credentials already in hand. "Officer Daniels, I'm Dr. Maya Kingsley from the Midwest Wildlife Recovery Center. The situation here is under my professional supervision as part of an emergency wildlife response. If you'll allow me to explain..." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he examined her identification. "Dr. Kingsley, your center is licensed for rehabilitation, but we have no record of this location being registered as a satellite facility." "That's exactly what we were discussing when you arrived," she replied smoothly. "The paperwork is being prepared as we speak. Given the emergency nature of the situation, we implemented field protocols first, with documentation to follow." Thomas watched this exchange with growing unease. The technical language and administrative details were beyond his expertise, but he understood the underlying message clearly enough. Their compassionate intervention existed in a gray area of wildlife regulations, and this officer had the authority to end it all with a few strokes of a pen. Officer Daniels seemed to consider Dr. Kingsley's explanation, his gaze shifting between her confident stance and Thomas's worried expression. "I'll need to see the animals in question and review your interim care protocols," he said finally, "and I expect all proper documentation to be filed within 48 hours. "Of course," Dr. Kingsley agreed readily. "We're committed to full compliance with all regulations. The welfare of the animals and the integrity of wildlife management processes are our highest priorities." As the officer followed them toward the barn, Thomas caught James's eye, sensing his old friend shared his concern. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had suddenly entered the complex realm of wildlife law enforcement, with consequences they hadn't fully considered when they first discovered the exhausted mother bobcat and her cubs. The barn's interior felt suddenly smaller with Officer Daniels' authoritative presence filling the space. The beam of his flashlight cut through the shadows, eventually landing on the makeshift enclosure they had constructed for the Bobcat family. Thomas held his breath, unsure what the official would make of their improvised rehabilitation setup. To everyone's surprise, the mother bobcat didn't retreat into the deeper recesses of the den at the approach of yet another human. Instead, she remained visible, her amber eyes reflecting the flashlight beam as she watched them with alert wariness. Perhaps she was simply too exhausted to flee, or perhaps, Thomas liked to think, she had begun to understand that these particular humans meant no harm. "That's the mother," Dr. Kingsley explained quietly. "As you can see, she's malnourished and recovering from an injury, but responsive and alert. The 3 cubs are behind her in the nesting area." Officer Daniels studied the scene with a professional eye, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "What's her prognosis?" he asked, directing the question to Dr. Kingsley rather than Thomas or Eleanor. "Guarded but improving," she replied promptly. "The infection is responding to antibiotics, her hydration is better, and she's maintaining adequate milk production for the cubs. With continued care, I expect a full recovery within 6 to 8 weeks, at which point we would begin pre-release conditioning." The officer nodded, making notes in a small notebook he had pulled from his shirt pocket. "And the cubs?" "Approximately 7 to 10 days old. Eyes still closed, but healthy weight and development. No signs of congenital issues or infection." Thomas watched this clinical exchange with growing unease. They were discussing the Bobcat family as if they were entries in a ledger, rather than living creatures who had fought against incredible odds to survive. He was about to interject when James placed a restraining hand on his shoulder, a silent warning to let the professionals handle this delicate negotiation. Officer Daniels completed his inspection of the enclosure, then turned to face them all. "I appreciate the emergency nature of the situation, and I can see that the animals are receiving appropriate care. However," he emphasized the word, his tone firming, "there are procedures that must be followed. Wildlife rehabilitation requires proper licensing, documentation, and adherence to state guidelines." "We're aware of the requirements," Dr. Kingsley assured him. "As I mentioned, we were in the process of filing the satellite facility paperwork when you arrived. The Midwest Recovery Center takes full responsibility for this case." The officer looked skeptical. "Usually the paperwork comes before the animals." "Usually, "We're not dealing with imminent death," Dr. Kingsley countered, a hint of steel entering her voice. When I received Mrs. Miller's email describing the condition of the mother bobcat, it was clear that waiting for administrative approval would have resulted in the loss of 4 protected native animals. A tense silence followed this statement, broken only by the soft mewling of the cubs as they nursed. Finally, Officer Daniels sighed, tucking his notebook away. "All right, Dr. Kingsley. I'll note in my report that this is a supervised emergency intervention with documentation pending, but I expect those forms on my desk by Friday morning, complete with the Recovery Center's official oversight documentation and Mr. Miller's temporary custodial agreement. You'll have them," she promised. As they walked back to the house, Thomas felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. "What was that about a custodial agreement?" he asked once they were out of the officer's earshot. Dr. Kingsley smiled reassuringly. "Standard procedure. It basically states that you're providing the housing and basic care under our center's supervision, rather than attempting unauthorized wildlife rehabilitation on your own. It protects both you and the animals." "And what happens if someone decides we're not qualified to provide that care?" Eleanor asked, giving voice to the concern that had been growing in Thomas's mind. "That won't happen," Dr. Kingsley said firmly. "I'm formally recommending this as the optimal rehabilitation situation given the center's current capacity issues. Plus," she added with a small smile, "I've worked with Officer Daniels before. He's by the book but reasonable. Once the paperwork is in order, he'll be satisfied." True to Dr. Kingsley's prediction, the officer departed with a warning rather than a citation, leaving them with a business card and a promise to return in 1 week to check on progress. Once his truck had disappeared down the long driveway, a collective sigh of relief passed through the group gathered on the porch. "That was close," James commented, breaking the tension. "Though I suspect it won't be the last official interest in your new house guests." Dr. Kingsley nodded in agreement. "This case is unusual enough to attract attention, especially given the overlap with the tracked bobcat population study. We should expect additional visits from research biologists as well as wildlife officials." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of what they had taken on. "When I found that bobcat in our barn, I never imagined we'd end up hosting government inspections and research teams. Welcome to the world of wildlife rehabilitation," Dr. Kingsley said with a sympathetic smile. "It's equal parts animal care and paperwork." As the evening deepened into night, plans were made for the coming days. Dr. Kingsley would return to Grand Island in the morning to retrieve the necessary documentation and additional supplies, while James would continue the medical treatment regimen they had established. Thomas and Eleanor would maintain the feeding schedule and monitoring that had already shown such promising results. After their guests had departed, James to his home in town, and Dr. Kingsley to the small motel on the highway, since she would return the next day, Thomas and Eleanor sat together on the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Quite a day," Eleanor remarked softly, her head resting against her husband's shoulder. Thomas agreed, his thoughts still processing everything that had happened. "Did we do the right thing, Ellie, taking this on?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think so," she finally said. "Not the easiest thing, certainly, but the right one." She lifted her head to look at him directly. "You're different since we found her, you know. There's a purpose to you again. I've missed seeing that." Thomas smiled faintly, recognizing the truth in her words. The bobcat had indeed rekindled something in him that the drought had nearly extinguished, a determination to nurture life against the odds, as his father would have put it. "We should probably give her a name," he said suddenly. "Can't keep calling her the mother bobcat forever." Eleanor chuckled. I thought you were against naming wild animals. Something about not getting too attached? Well, it seems we're already past that point, Thomas admitted. Besides, all the paperwork probably needs a designation beyond Bobcat female adult. What about Mara? Eleanor suggested after a thoughtful pause. It means bitter in Hebrew, fitting for what she's endured, but it also sounds a bit like miracle, which is what her survival has been. Thomas tested the name silently, finding it somehow perfect for the fierce, determined creature who had appeared in their lives so unexpectedly. Mara it is, he agreed. And the cubs? Let's see what personalities they develop once their eyes open, Eleanor suggested. Names should fit the bearer after all. Later that night, Thomas made one final trip to the barn before bed, flashlight in hand, to check on their charges. Approaching quietly, he directed the beam toward the enclosure, careful to keep the light angled away from sensitive eyes. Mara was awake, her posture more relaxed than he had yet seen. The cubs were nestled against her belly, sleeping peacefully after their evening meal. As the light caught her eyes, she looked directly at Thomas without the fearful aggression of previous encounters. Hello, Mara, he said softly, testing the name. That's what we're calling you now. Hope you don't mind. To his amazement, the bobcat blinked slowly, almost like a cat's gesture of trust, before lowering her head to rest it upon her paws. She didn't sleep. He could see she remained vigilant, but neither did she display any distress at his presence. Progress, Thomas whispered to himself, carefully backing away to leave her in peace. Small steps, but progress all the same. As he walked back to the house under the vast canopy of stars, Thomas reflected that perhaps the same could be said for himself. Small steps toward recovering his own sense of purpose, his connection to the land and the life it supported, even in these harsh times. The path ahead would not be easy for any of them, but for the first time in months he felt equal to the challenge. The next week brought a rhythm to life at the Miller farm that centered around their wild guests. Dr. Kingsley had returned with official documentation, converting a corner of the barn into a legitimate satellite rehabilitation facility, complete with proper signage and a logbook for recording observations and treatments. James visited daily, his expertise proving invaluable as Mara's condition steadily improved. The infected wound was healing cleanly now, her coat regaining some of its natural luster as proper nutrition restored her strength. Most remarkable, however, was the change in Mara's behavior. While still unmistakably wild, she had begun to show signs of what Dr. Kingsley called situational trust, a temporary acceptance of human presence that fell far short of domestication, but allowed for closer observation and care. She understands we're helping her, Thomas insisted one morning as he and Dr. Kingsley watched Mara accept food from a long-handled tray. What she understands is that you represent a reliable food source and haven't harmed her or her cubs, Dr. Kingsley corrected gently. It's important not to anthropomorphize too much, Thomas. She remains a wild predator with instincts that have evolved over thousands of years. Thomas nodded, accepting the scientific explanation, but privately he believed there was more to it. He had spent countless hours sitting quietly near the enclosure, sometimes reading aloud from the newspaper or simply talking about the day's work on the farm. Something in those amber eyes reflected more than just animal calculation, or perhaps he was simply seeing what he needed to see. On the 8th day since Mara's arrival, a milestone was reached. The first cub opened its eyes. Thomas was alone in the barn when it happened, updating the logbook with the morning's observations. A small movement caught his attention, and he turned to see one of the cubs, the largest of the three, blinking owlishly at the world for the first time. "Well, hello there," Thomas whispered, setting aside his pen. The cub, startled by this new visual information, let out a tiny mewl and pressed closer to its mother. Mara responded by curling more protectively around her young, watching Thomas with heightened alertness, but no aggression. By the time Eleanor brought lunch to the barn, all 3 cubs had their eyes open, their tiny faces transformed by this new awareness. The couple sat together on a hay bale, watching the family with a sense of awe that hadn't diminished despite the days of familiarity. "They need names now," Eleanor said, passing Thomas a sandwich. "No more putting it off." Thomas studied the cubs thoughtfully. The first to open its eyes was slightly larger than the others, with bold markings and an adventurous spirit already evident in the way it explored the boundaries of the nesting area. The second was more delicately built, its movements graceful even in infancy. The third, the smallest, had a distinctive white patch on its chest that stood out against the typical spotted coat. "The bold one is Scout," Thomas decided. "The graceful one can be Willow, and the little one with the white chest." He paused, considering. "Patch." Eleanor smiled her approval. "Scout, Willow, and Patch it is. Though Dr. Kingsley will probably insist on more scientific designations for her records." "Let her," Thomas said with a newfound confidence that surprised them both. "Names matter. They make this real in a way that cubs A, B, and C never could." That afternoon, Dr. Kingsley arrived with an unexpected companion, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually distracted air. She introduced him as Professor Alan Merritt from the University of Nebraska, a wildlife biologist specializing in bobcat populations. "When I mentioned this case to Alan, he was fascinated," Dr. Kingsley explained as they walked to the barn, "especially given the possible connection to the tracked female that was found deceased." Professor Merritt maintained a respectful silence until they reached the enclosure, but once he laid eyes on Mara and the cubs, his professional reserve melted into genuine excitement. "Extraordinary," he breathed, pulling a small notebook from his pocket and scribbling rapidly. "Based on her markings, I believe this is indeed the female we've been tracking as B27. She lost her collar last winter during a period of heavy snow." He pointed to a distinctive pattern of spots on Mara's left flank. "That marking configuration is unique to her. We have photographs from when she was originally tagged." He turned to Thomas and Eleanor, his academic demeanor softening. "You've done something remarkable here. B27, Mara, as you've named her, had established an unusual territory overlap with the deceased female B19. Our research suggests they may have been mother and daughter, though we can't confirm without genetic testing." "Would that explain why she took in cubs that weren't hers?" Eleanor asked. The professor nodded eagerly. "It's one possibility. If B19 was her daughter, those cubs would be her grand offspring. Bobcats don't typically form extended family groups, but there's emerging evidence of cooperative behavior between related females, especially in stressed environmental conditions." Thomas felt a surge of vindication at this scientific support for what he had instinctively sensed, that Mara's actions represented something beyond ordinary animal behavior. So she didn't just stumble across them by chance, she made a deliberate choice to care for them. "It appears so," Professor Merritt agreed, "which makes her successful recovery all the more significant from a research perspective. This kind of behavioral adaptation could be crucial for species survival as climate change creates more environmental stressors." Over dinner at the farmhouse, the professor elaborated on his research, describing how the multi-year drought had altered bobcat territories and behaviors throughout the region. Traditional hunting grounds had been abandoned, prey distributions had shifted, and competition for resources had intensified. "What we're witnessing may be evolutionary adaptation in real time," he explained, his thin hands gesturing expressively. "Behavioral flexibility in response to environmental change, exactly what a species needs to survive long-term shifts in habitat conditions." "And you want to study Mara and the cubs as part of this research?" Thomas clarified, already sensing where the conversation was heading. "If you're amenable, the professor confirmed. It would involve periodic visits, some non-invasive monitoring equipment, and possibly DNA samples once it's safe to handle the cubs. All conducted under Dr. Kingsley's rehabilitation protocols, of course. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances, a silent communication born of decades together. As long as it doesn't interfere with their recovery or eventual release, Eleanor said finally, we have no objection. Excellent, Professor Merritt beamed. I'll coordinate everything through Maya, Dr. Kingsley, to ensure minimal disruption. After their guests had departed, promising to return the following week with research equipment, Thomas and Eleanor found themselves once again alone with the sudden expansion of what had begun as a simple act of compassion. Our little secret's becoming quite the production, Eleanor remarked, as they washed the dinner dishes together. Thomas handed her a plate to dry. Having second thoughts? Not at all, she replied without hesitation. Actually, I was thinking it might be good for the community to know what's happening here. The drought has hit everyone hard. Some good news might lift spirits. Thomas considered this, remembering how the Bobcat family had affected his own outlook. You might be right, though we'd need to be careful. Don't want a parade of curious visitors disturbing Mara and the cubs. Of course, Eleanor agreed. But maybe a small piece in the county newspaper, educational, focusing on the research and rehabilitation aspects. The idea took root in Thomas's mind, expanding to include possibilities he hadn't considered before. The drought had isolated many in their farming community, each household struggling privately with the same challenges. Perhaps Mara's story could serve as a rallying point, a reminder of resilience in the face of adversity. Let me talk to Maya and James first, he said. Make sure we're not violating any wildlife regulations or compromising the cubs' eventual release. But if they approve, I think you're onto something, Ellie. That night, as had become his custom, Thomas made a final check on the Bobcat family before bed. Mara was awake as usual, her motherly vigilance undiminished despite her improving health. The cubs, however, were increasingly active, tumbling over each other in clumsy play now that their eyes had opened to the world around them. Scout, true to the name Thomas had given him, was exploring the farthest reaches of the enclosure, while Willow watched from beside her mother, her delicate head tilted in apparent curiosity. Patch, the smallest, had fallen asleep mid-play, his tiny body sprawled dramatically across Mara's outstretched paw. The scene struck Thomas with unexpected emotional force, not because it seemed human, but because it so perfectly embodied the wild essence of these creatures, while simultaneously reflecting the universal language of family. Different, but the same. Foreign, yet familiar. Rest well, he murmured, retreating from the enclosure. Big days ahead for all of us. The county newspaper, the Plainview Herald, wasn't much more than a weekly collection of community announcements, agricultural updates, and the occasional human interest story. Its editor, Maggie Whitaker, had been running the paper for nearly 3 decades, fighting to keep local journalism alive in an era of media consolidation and internet news. When Thomas called her to propose a story about the Bobcat Rehabilitation Project, her response was immediate and enthusiastic. I'll be out tomorrow morning, she declared. This is exactly the kind of story people need right now, Thomas. True to her word, Maggie arrived at the farm the next day, her ancient Subaru raising dust clouds as it bumped along the driveway. At 68, she remained a force of nature, 5 feet of determined energy topped with a shock of silver hair that seemed to defy gravity. She carried a professional camera and a worn leather notebook that had recorded the county's history for longer than some residents had been alive. So Thomas Miller turned wildlife rehabilitator. She greeted him, her handshake firm despite her age. Never would have predicted that plot twist. Thomas smiled, leading her toward the barn. Neither would I, Maggie. But life has a way of surprising you. Maggie had known Thomas since he was a boy working alongside his father. She'd covered the Miller farm multiple times over the years, during banner harvests after the destructive hailstorm of '98, when Thomas and Eleanor had taken in their orphan nephew. She had a knack for finding the emotional heart of a story while maintaining journalistic integrity. "Before we go in," Thomas cautioned at the barn entrance, "Dr. Kingsley left strict instructions about photography. No flash, limited time exposure, and we need to maintain a respectful distance. Mara, that's the mother bobcat, is still a wild animal and we don't want to stress her." Maggie nodded solemnly. "I understand completely. Conservation first, story second." Inside, Maggie's professional demeanor briefly slipped as she caught her first glimpse of the Bobcat family. "Oh my," she breathed, her hand unconsciously rising to her heart. "They're magnificent." The past week had seen remarkable developments. Mara's health had improved significantly. Her coat now gleamed with vitality, her movements fluid and controlled as she supervised her increasingly active cubs. The makeshift enclosure had been expanded under Dr. Kingsley's guidance, providing more space for the growing family while maintaining the security they needed. The cubs, now with eyes fully open and increasingly coordinated movements, had developed distinct personalities that matched the names Thomas had given them. Scout led every exploration, fearlessly investigating new objects or sounds. Willow observed everything with cautious intelligence before acting. Patch, despite being the smallest, showed a mischievous streak, often pouncing on his siblings from carefully planned hiding spots. "They're about 2 weeks old now," Thomas explained as Maggie took notes and carefully composed photographs. "Dr. Kingsley says they're developing right on schedule, maybe even ahead a bit. And the mother, Mara, she's not the birth mother," Maggie clarified, her journalistic precision emerging. "That's what the research suggests," Thomas confirmed, explaining Professor Merritt's theory about the family relationship between the two female bobcats. "She basically adopted them after their birth mother was killed, even though she was injured and starving herself." Maggie's pencil moved rapidly across her notebook. "Talk about a metaphor for community resilience," she murmured. "Taking care of others even when you're struggling yourself." After observing the bobcats, Maggie interviewed Thomas and Eleanor about the discovery, the intervention, and the official rehabilitation program that had developed. Her questions were thoughtful and thorough, focusing not just on the animals but on how the experience had affected the Millers. "Has this changed your perspective on the drought, on farming?" she asked as they sat at the kitchen table, mugs of coffee before them. Thomas considered the question carefully. "It's reminded me that adaptation is possible," he said finally. "Mara found a way to survive when her normal patterns weren't working anymore. Maybe there's a lesson there for all of us." Eleanor added her own thoughts. "We've been so focused on what we've lost, the crops, the spring, the certainty we once had. Mara showed up with nothing but determination and 3 cubs that needed her. Somehow, that shifted our thinking from what's been lost to what might still be possible." Maggie's article appeared in the next edition of the Herald under the headline, "Unlikely Sanctuary, Drought Brings Bobcat Family to Miller Farm." The piece was masterfully written, balancing the emotional appeal of the story with educational information about bobcats, drought impact on wildlife, and the official rehabilitation protocols. Accompanying photos showed Mara and her cubs, Thomas and Eleanor beside the enclosure, and Dr. Kingsley demonstrating rehabilitation techniques. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By the following afternoon, the Miller's phone hadn't stopped ringing, neighbors offering support, regional news outlets requesting interviews, and community members asking how they could help. The local feed store owner called to donate supplies. The high school science teacher wanted to know if she could bring students for an educational visit. Even the county commissioner reached out, suggesting that the project might qualify for emergency conservation funding. "I had no idea it would generate this much interest," Thomas said, somewhat overwhelmed by the attention as he and Eleanor sorted through the messages. "People need hope right now," Eleanor replied wisely. "Mara's story gives them that." Dr. Kingsley called that evening, her tone mixing professional concern with undeniable excitement. "The article has gone viral, Thomas, far beyond the county newspaper. State wildlife officials have seen it, and so has the governor's environmental advisor." "Is that a problem?" Thomas asked, tension creeping into his voice. The last thing they needed was additional regulatory scrutiny. "Quite the opposite," Dr. Kingsley assured him. "They're viewing this as a public education opportunity. The Department of Natural Resources is considering featuring Mara's rehabilitation in their drought response materials, an example of wildlife adaptability and human-wildlife cooperation during environmental stress." She paused, then added more cautiously, "But we need to be careful about the increased attention. Too much human exposure could compromise the cubs' eventual return to the wild. We need to balance education with protection." By the week's end, a plan had been developed. The barn would be modified to include a small, separate viewing area where limited groups could observe the bobcat family without disturbing them. Educational materials would be created explaining bobcat biology, behavior, and the impacts of environmental change on wildlife. Most importantly, a schedule would ensure that Mara and the cubs had long periods without human presence, maintaining their wild instincts and behaviors. Professor Merritt arrived with his research equipment, setting up non-invasive monitoring systems that would record the family's activities 24 hours a day. "This is unprecedented data," he explained excitedly as he calibrated a motion-activated camera. "The interaction between the cubs and their adoptive mother, their development patterns, their response to rehabilitation protocols, it's a goldmine for understanding bobcat adaptability." Through all this activity, Thomas maintained his twice-daily private visits with Mara and the cubs, early morning and late evening, when the barn was quiet and the family was most active. These moments had become sacred to him, a time of connection that transcended the scientific interest and public education aspects of the project. On a particularly still evening, as Thomas sat quietly observing the family, something extraordinary happened. Scout, now able to move with impressive coordination for his 3 weeks of life, approached the edge of the enclosure nearest to where Thomas sat. The small cub studied him with bright, curious eyes, showing none of the fear that should have been instinctive. Thomas remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. From her position in the center of the enclosure, Mara watched the interaction with alert attention, but made no move to call her adopted cub back from this exploration. After several moments of mutual observation, Scout let out a tiny chirp, not a distress call, but what Thomas had come to recognize as a sound of curiosity or interest. Then, as if satisfied with this investigation, the cub turned and scampered back to his siblings, engaging immediately in a tumbling play session that spoke of healthy development and growing strength. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Thomas. That brief exchange, wild creature to human observer, represented a bridge between worlds that rarely intersected so peacefully. Not domestication, not taming, but a momentary acknowledgement across the species divide. Later, recording the interaction in the logbook as required by the rehabilitation protocols, Thomas struggled to find words that wouldn't sound fanciful or anthropomorphic. In the end, he simply wrote, "Scout approached observer position, showed curiosity rather than fear. Mara allowed approach without intervention. Significant trust milestone." What he didn't write, couldn't articulate even to Eleanor, was how that small moment had affected him personally, how the trust of these wild creatures had somehow restored his own trust in the future, despite the parched fields and uncertain harvests that still surrounded them. As May gave way to June, life at the Miller farm settled into a new normal that revolved around the Bobcat family's rehabilitation schedule. The cubs were growing rapidly, their bodies transforming from the helpless newborns Thomas had first encountered into coordinated, playful youngsters with distinct personalities. At 4 weeks old, they were beginning to show interest in solid food, though they still relied primarily on their mother's milk. Dr. Kingsley had expanded the enclosure again, creating climbing structures from natural materials that would help the cubs develop the strength and agility they would need for survival in the wild. Thomas took particular pride in the fallen tree branch he had carefully selected from the property, its gnarled form providing perfect climbing challenges for small bobcat paws. "They're making remarkable progress," Dr. Kingsley noted during her bi-weekly assessment. "Mara has been an excellent mother, teaching them appropriate behaviors despite the artificial environment." Indeed, Mara had established clear boundaries for her adoptive cubs, encouraging their exploration while correcting them with gentle cuffs when they became too rambunctious. She demonstrated hunting techniques using the enrichment toys Dr. Kingsley provided, small objects that mimicked prey movements when activated. Scout, Willow, and Patch would watch with rapt attention as their mother stalked, pounced, and captured these false prey items, then attempt to copy her movements with varying degrees of success. The educational program that had developed around the rehabilitation project had exceeded everyone's expectations. Twice weekly, small groups of visitors, mostly school children and college students, would observe the Bobcat family from the viewing area that had been constructed at a respectful distance from the enclosure. Dr. Kingsley or Professor Merritt would provide information about bobcat biology, behavior, and conservation, using Mara's story to illustrate the broader impacts of environmental change on wildlife. Thomas, initially skeptical about opening their farm to strangers, had come to appreciate these educational sessions. There was something deeply satisfying about watching young faces light up with understanding, about hearing their thoughtful questions and seeing their genuine concern for the natural world. It reminded him of his own childhood fascination with the wildlife that shared the farm's acres, a connection to nature that modern children often lacked. Mr. Miller, a young girl had asked during a recent visit, "Will Mara and her babies be okay when you let them go back to the wild? What if the drought doesn't end?" The question, innocent yet profound, had haunted Thomas for days afterward. It was the unspoken concern that underlay the entire rehabilitation effort, the recognition that the environment these bobcats would eventually return to remained hostile in many ways. The drought had eased slightly with a few scattered spring rains, but long-term forecasts offered little hope for truly normal conditions returning anytime soon. Eleanor had sensed his preoccupation with this question and addressed it head-on as they sat on the porch one evening. "You can't control the weather, Thomas. All we can do is give them the best chance possible and trust that the adaptability that brought Mara to our barn will serve her well when she leaves." He knew she was right, but the feeling of responsibility had only grown stronger as the weeks passed and the bond between the Millers and their wild guests deepened. It wasn't just Thomas and Eleanor who had become invested in the Bobcat's future. The entire community seemed to have embraced Mara's story as a symbol of resilience. The Plainview Herald now featured a weekly update on the rehabilitation project. Local artists had created Bobcat-themed works for a charity auction benefiting wildlife conservation. The elementary school had even named their sports teams the Bobcats in Mara's honor, replacing their previous Plainview Pioneers mascot with unanimous school board approval. Most significantly, the project had sparked renewed interest in drought mitigation efforts throughout the county. Farmers who had been stubbornly clinging to traditional methods began attending workshops on water conservation and climate-adaptive agriculture. The town council approved funding for a rainwater harvesting system at the community center. Even the most skeptical old-timers had started acknowledging that perhaps some adaptation was necessary, if their way of life was to survive changing conditions. "It's remarkable what one desperate mother bobcat has accomplished," James commented during a routine checkup visit. "She's changing minds that have been set in concrete for generations." "People can relate to her," Thomas replied, watching as James examined the cubs from a distance, checking their development against standardized growth charts. "Fighting to save your family, adapting to impossible circumstances. That's something everyone understands, whether you're a farmer or a bobcat." James nodded thoughtfully. The professor was right about behavioral adaptation being the key to survival. Turns out that applies to humans as much as wildlife. The professor himself had become a regular presence at the farm, his initial academic interest in the bobcats blossoming into genuine affection for the family he studied so meticulously. His research team had expanded to include 2 graduate students who took turns monitoring the family's behaviors, carefully documenting every milestone in the cubs' development. Scout attempted his first true pounce today, one of the students, Aisha, reported excitedly one afternoon. Completely unprompted, Mara was grooming herself, and he stalked and pounced on a piece of straw that moved in the breeze, perfect form for his age. Thomas beamed with almost paternal pride. That boy's going to be a hunter for sure. The property had become something of a research hub, with various scientists making pilgrimages to observe what Professor Merritt had begun calling the adaptive family unit. Ornithologists noted changes in local bird populations responding to the drought. Botanists cataloged the resilient plant species that continued to thrive despite reduced rainfall. Hydrologists studied the remaining water sources on the property, mapping the underground aquifer that still supplied the farm's wells when so many others had run dry. This scientific attention brought unexpected benefits beyond knowledge. Grant funding began flowing into the community for drought research. Infrastructure improvements followed. Most surprisingly, a water conservation technology company based in Colorado offered to install their latest irrigation system on the Miller farm at no cost. Seeing an opportunity to demonstrate their product's effectiveness under extreme conditions while associating their brand with the now famous Bobcat rehabilitation story. The governor himself had called, expressing interest in visiting the project as part of a new state initiative on wildlife conservation during climate events. Though this had been politely declined by Dr. Kingsley, too much disruption for the animals, she explained firmly, it signaled how far the ripples from Mara's arrival had spread. Through all this activity and attention, the bond between Thomas and the Bobcat family continued to deepen in quiet, private moments. Each morning and evening, he maintained his ritual of sitting near the enclosure, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes simply observing in companionable silence. Mara had grown so accustomed to his presence that she would often bring the cubs to the edge of the enclosure nearest his position, grooming them or supervising their play within his view. A demonstration of trust that Dr. Kingsley called unprecedented in a non-imprinted adult bobcat. The cubs, now able to recognize individual humans by sight and scent, showed particular interest in Thomas. Scout would often pause in his explorations to observe the farmer intently. Willow would approach the enclosure when Thomas spoke, her head tilted as if listening to his words. Even cautious little Patch had developed a game of stalking toward Thomas before darting away, a form of play that Professor Merritt suggested might combine natural hunting behavior with social interaction. "They're not becoming tame," Dr. Kingsley assured Thomas when he expressed concern about these behaviors. "They're simply habituating to specific humans in a specific context. Once they're released and encounter humans in the wild, their natural wariness will reassert itself, especially with Mara's guidance." Thomas hoped she was right. The thought of these magnificent creatures approaching hunters or trappers with the same curiosity they showed him was unbearable. Yet he couldn't bring himself to reduce his interactions with them. to withdraw the human connection that seemed to bring them as much comfort as it brought him. As June progressed, the rehabilitation plan entered a new phase. The cubs were now eating solid food regularly, specially prepared meat mixtures that would gradually transition to whole prey items. Mara's strength had fully returned, her sleek body showing no signs of the emaciation that had marked her arrival. The time was approaching when the family would need to begin pre-release conditioning, a carefully structured process that would gradually reintroduce them to the challenges of wild living while minimizing human contact. The pre-release conditioning phase began in mid-June, transforming the rehabilitation project once again. Under Dr. Kingsley's direction, the enclosure was expanded dramatically, incorporating a portion of the natural woodland that bordered the farm's eastern boundary. This hybrid space, part constructed environment, part wild habitat, would serve as the Bobcat family's final preparation for full freedom. The transition needs to be gradual, Dr. Kingsley explained as she and Thomas walked the perimeter of the new enclosure. Mara has regained her strength and wild instincts, but the cubs have never known true wilderness. They need to learn how to navigate it safely. The expanded area was enclosed with specialized fencing that would prevent escape while allowing the bobcats to experience natural conditions: trees to climb, undergrowth to hide in, earth to dig. Most importantly, it provided space for hunting practice with live prey, a critical skill the cubs would need to master before release. "We'll start with small, easily captured prey items," Dr. Kingsley continued. "Crickets, mice, small birds. They'll learn by watching Mara, but they need to develop their own techniques through trial and error." Thomas nodded, understanding the necessity but feeling a pang at the thought of the innocent creatures that would become hunting practice for the cubs. Nature's balance required predators as much as prey, a truth he had always known as a farmer, but now felt with new immediacy. The educational program adapted to this new phase as well. Public viewings were suspended, replaced by remote video feeds that allowed observation without human presence. Professor Merritt's research team installed wildlife cameras throughout the expanded enclosure, capturing round-the-clock footage of the family's activities. "The data we're collecting is revolutionary," the professor told Thomas one evening as they reviewed the day's footage. "We're documenting hunting skill transmission from an adoptive mother to cubs, something never before recorded in detail for bobcats. The implications for understanding behavioral versus genetic components of predator skills are enormous." Thomas watched the screen as Mara demonstrated a stalking technique to attentive cubs, her body low to the ground, movements precise and controlled. The cubs attempted to mimic her, their efforts comical, yet showing clear improvement from earlier attempts. Scout had grasped the basics most quickly, his natural boldness tempered now by increasing patience. Willow's approach was more calculated, her stalking technique already showing the precision that would one day make her a formidable hunter. Patch compensated for his smaller size with creative ambush tactics, often achieving success through unexpected approaches. "They're all finding their own ways," Thomas observed. "Different styles, but effective." "Exactly," the professor agreed eagerly. "Individual variation within inherited and learned behavioral frameworks. It's fascinating how their personalities influence their hunting approaches." The new phase brought challenges as well as progress. One morning in late June, Thomas arrived at the enclosure to find Dr. Kingsley and her team in a state of controlled alarm. Scout had injured his paw during a night hunting exercise, a deep cut that required medical intervention. "We need to sedate him to treat it properly," Dr. Kingsley explained, preparing a dart gun with practiced efficiency. "The risk of infection is too high to leave it untreated." Thomas watched anxiously as she took careful aim and fired the sedative dart with precision born of years of wildlife veterinary work. The dart found its mark, and Scout soon succumbed to the medication, collapsing gently onto the forest floor. Mara's reaction was immediate and intense, a low growl emanating from deep in her chest as she positioned herself between humans and her vulnerable cub. "This is the most dangerous moment," Dr. Kingsley murmured, motioning for everyone to remain absolutely still. She could perceive this as a threat to her young. For several tense minutes they waited, allowing Mara to investigate Scout's sedated form and understand that he was alive, merely unconscious. Gradually, her aggressive posture softened, though her eyes remained fixed on the humans beyond the enclosure. "I need to go in now," Dr. Kingsley said quietly. "Thomas, keep talking to her in your normal voice. She's most familiar with you. It might help keep her calm." Thomas began speaking, his voice deliberately steady despite his racing heart. "It's all right, Mara. We're helping Scout. He'll be fine, just needs a little medical attention. You're a good mother protecting your boy like that. Smart girl, understanding we're trying to help." As he maintained this soothing monologue, Dr. Kingsley entered the enclosure and approached Scout's prone form. Mara watched intently, muscles tense but making no move to attack. Working quickly, Dr. Kingsley cleaned and treated the wound, applying antibiotics and a light bandage that would fall off naturally within days. "There," she said softly as she completed the procedure. "All done. He'll be waking up soon. Good as new." They retreated from the enclosure, watching as Scout gradually regained consciousness under Mara's attentive supervision. The trust that had been built over weeks of rehabilitation had passed its greatest test. Mara had allowed them to help her cub, despite every wild instinct that would have demanded she drive them away. "That was remarkable," Dr. Kingsley breathed once they were safely outside the enclosure. "I've worked with wildlife for 15 years, and I've never seen a wild bobcat allow medical intervention on her young without attempting to attack. The bond you've established with her is extraordinary." Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions: pride at the trust he'd earned, sadness at the knowledge that this trust would need to be broken for the bobcat's successful return to the wild. "Will this set back their pre-release conditioning?" he asked, focusing on the practical concern. "Surprisingly, no," Dr. Kingsley replied. "In fact, it might provide an important lesson." Mara demonstrated appropriate caution while making a situational judgment about danger versus help. That kind of discernment will serve her well in the wild, where not every novel situation is a threat, but careful assessment is always necessary. As July approached, bringing with it the scorching heat of high summer, signs of the drought's lessening grip began to appear across the landscape. A series of thunderstorms had rolled through the region, not enough to end the water shortage but sufficient to green the parched fields and replenish some of the smaller water sources. Wildlife began returning to areas they had abandoned months earlier, sensing the shift toward more favorable conditions. Professor Merritt regarded these changes with cautious optimism during his weekly assessment. "The ecosystem is showing resilience," he noted, reviewing satellite imagery of the region on his tablet. "Plant regrowth is attracting insects and small mammals, which in turn will support predator populations like our bobcat family. The timing may work in our favor for their eventual release." The release plan was taking shape, its timing dependent on the cub's development and environmental conditions. Dr. Kingsley had identified several potential release sites, areas with suitable bobcat habitat, adequate prey populations, and minimal human activity. The most promising location was a nature preserve about 30 miles from the Miller farm, where the bobcats would receive continued monitoring via tracking collars, but no direct human intervention. "We'll collar them about 2 weeks before release," she explained during a planning meeting that included Thomas, Eleanor, James, and Professor Merritt. "The collars are designed to detach automatically after 18 months, by which time we'll have gathered sufficient data on their post-release adaptation, and the cubs will be fully mature." "And if they don't adapt well?" Eleanor asked the question that had been weighing on Thomas's mind. If they struggle to hunt or encounter problems we haven't anticipated. Dr. Kingsley's expression was compassionate but firm. We'll monitor them closely, but intervention would be limited to true emergency situations. The goal is independent survival. Anything less would be a failure of rehabilitation. Thomas understood the scientific logic, the conservation principles that demanded wild animals remain wild, yet he couldn't help the protective instinct that had grown within him. These creatures had become more than research subjects or rehabilitation cases. They were, in some indefinable way, part of the farm, part of the community's shared story of perseverance. As the meeting concluded, Thomas stepped outside for a moment alone, gazing across fields that now showed tentative signs of recovery. The evening light cast long shadows, creating a patchwork of gold and darkness that mirrored his own mixed emotions about the approaching release. Eleanor joined him, slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of decades together. "You're worried about them," she said simply. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's known you for 40 years, she replied with a gentle smile. "But Thomas, you've given them everything they need to succeed, not just food and shelter, but confidence and skills. Whatever happens when they return to the wild, that gift remains." He nodded, drawing comfort from her wisdom as he had countless times through their years together. "I just wish we could know they'll be all right." "That's the hardest part of letting go," she agreed, "but it's also the most necessary." August arrived with a surprising gift: rain. Not the brief, violent thunderstorms that had teased the land in July, but steady, soaking precipitation that fell for 3 days straight, replenishing parched soil and refilling streams that had been reduced to dusty channels. The drought wasn't over. Meteorologists were careful to point that out in their cautiously optimistic forecasts, but a significant corner had been turned. For the Bobcat family, this environmental improvement accelerated the timeline for release. The cubs, now nearly 3 months old, had developed remarkable hunting proficiency under Mara's tutelage. They could successfully take down rabbits, catch birds, and find the small rodents that formed the bulk of a bobcat's natural diet. Their physical development had progressed exactly as expected. Muscles toned from constant play and practice, reflexes lightning quick, senses finely tuned to their environment. "They're ready," Dr. Kingsley announced after her final pre-release assessment. "Developmentally, they're ahead of schedule for cubs their age. Mara has been an exceptional mother and teacher." The release date was set for August 15th, a decision that filled Thomas with conflicting emotions. He understood the necessity, had always known this day would come, yet the prospect of saying goodbye to the creatures who had transformed his outlook left a hollow feeling in his chest. The days leading up to the release were filled with final preparations. The bobcats were sedated briefly to be fitted with tracking collars, lightweight devices that would transmit their locations to satellites, allowing the research team to monitor their movements without human interference. Blood samples were taken for a final health check and to provide genetic material for Professor Merritt's research. The nature preserve that would become their new home was surveyed one last time to confirm its suitability. On the evening before the release, Thomas made his final visit to the enclosure. The Bobcat family was active in the twilight hours, the cubs engaging in what seemed like particularly exuberant play, while Mara watched from a fallen log, her posture relaxed yet vigilant. Thomas settled in his usual observation spot, content to simply watch them in silence, committing each movement, each interaction to memory. After nearly an hour, Mara rose from her position and approached the edge of the enclosure nearest to Thomas. She sat there, amber eyes fixed on him with that penetrating gaze that had never failed to touch something profound within him. For several minutes, they regarded each other, wild creature and human observer connected by circumstance and choice across the divide of species. "Be well out there," Thomas said softly, allowing himself this moment of sentiment. "Take care of those little ones." As if in response, Mara blinked slowly. That gesture of feline trust that had become familiar over their months together, then turned and padded silently back to her cubs, gathering them with gentle nudges toward their sleeping area as night descended fully. Thomas returned to the house with a sense of closure, a recognition that this chapter was ending exactly as it should, with Mara and her cubs prepared to reclaim their wild heritage, and with himself forever changed by their brief intersection with his life. The release itself was deliberately unceremonious despite interest from media and the community. Dr. Kingsley had insisted on minimal human presence, just the core team that had been involved in the rehabilitation. Shortly after dawn, the transport carriers containing the sedated Bobcat family were loaded into Dr. Kingsley's vehicle. Thomas and Eleanor followed in their truck, with Professor Merritt and James completing the small convoy that made its way to the nature preserve. The site chosen for release was a clearing beside a small stream, surrounded by dense forest that would provide immediate cover and familiar territory, similar to the expanded enclosure where the family had spent their final rehabilitation weeks. The carriers were placed in a semicircle, doors facing the forest, their occupants beginning to stir as the mild sedatives wore off. "We'll open the doors simultaneously," Dr. Kingsley instructed, "then retreat immediately to the observation blind. No voices, no sudden movements. Let them emerge at their own pace." The team positioned themselves at the carriers, Thomas kneeling beside Mara's. At Dr. Kingsley's silent count, they unlatched the doors in unison, then backed away quickly, disappearing into the camouflaged blind about 50 yards distant. Through binoculars, they watched as one by one the Bobcats emerged. Mara was first, her movements cautious yet confident as she tested this new environment. Scout followed, then Willow, and finally Patch. The family grouped together at the edge of the clearing, Mara alert for any threat, while the cubs investigated their surroundings with characteristic curiosity. For nearly an hour, the Bobcats remained in the clearing, alternately exploring and returning to the security of their family unit. Then, with a communication too subtle for human observers to detect, Mara led her cubs toward the forest. At the tree line, she paused, looking back toward the blind where she somehow sensed human presence. For a brief moment, Thomas felt she was looking directly at him. One final acknowledgement between unlikely allies. Then she turned, and with fluid grace the Bobcat family disappeared into the dappled shadows of their natural home. Silence hung in the observation blind, broken finally by Professor Merritt's quiet voice. "The tracking signals are strong. They're moving steadily northeast toward the heart of the preserve." "And so it begins," Dr. Kingsley said, a note of professional satisfaction in her tone. "The true test of rehabilitation is successful reintegration into the wild. Everything looks promising so far." Thomas remained silent, the lump in his throat making speech impossible. Eleanor's hand found his, squeezing gently in understanding. The scientific objectives had been met, the conservation goals achieved, but the emotional impact of watching the Bobcats return to the wild was something statistics and tracking data could never capture. The months that followed brought regular updates as the tracking collars transmitted the family's movements throughout the preserve. They had established a territory that included several reliable water sources and abundant prey, moving with the natural rhythm of seasons and needs. The data showed hunting successes, rest periods, exploration of new areas, all indicators of successful readaptation to wild living. Occasionally, wildlife cameras placed throughout the preserve would capture images of the family, Mara leading her growing cubs along game trails, the young Bobcats practicing increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques, all four grooming each other during rest periods in patches of sunlight. These glimpses of their continued thriving were precious to Thomas, tangible evidence that their intervention had truly given this family a second chance. The Bobcat Rehabilitation Project left lasting legacies beyond the animals themselves. The Miller Farm became a model for integrated wildlife conservation on agricultural land. The educational materials developed during the project were adopted by schools throughout the region. Professor Merritt's research, published in several prestigious scientific journals, contributed valuable new understanding of behavioral adaptation and maternal care in bobcats. Perhaps most significantly, the community's response to drought conditions transformed in subtle but important ways. Water conservation practices, once viewed with skepticism by many farmers, became standard procedure. Habitat preservation efforts gained traction even among the most traditional landowners. The interconnection between agricultural success and wildlife health entered the common understanding in ways that transcended political divisions or generational differences. For Thomas and Eleanor, life returned to its familiar rhythms, but with perspectives permanently altered. The barn where Mara had sought refuge was converted into a small wildlife education center, hosting school groups and community workshops on conservation and coexistence with native species. Their farming practices evolved to incorporate more drought-resistant techniques and wildlife-friendly approaches, creating a more resilient operation that respected both their livelihood needs and the natural systems that supported them. 1 year after the release, on a crisp August morning, much like the day Mara had first appeared in their lives, Thomas stood at the edge of his eastern field, surveying land that had recovered remarkably from the drought's grip. Crops grew in neat rows, where parched earth had once cracked and crumbled. Birds called from the hedgerows that had been expanded and enhanced to provide wildlife corridors across the property. Movement at the forest edge caught his attention, a flash of spotted fur quickly gone. Thomas froze, heart suddenly racing. It could have been any bobcat, of course. The species was native to the area and making a comeback thanks to improved habitat conditions. Yet something in that brief glimpse, the fluid movement, the distinctive pattern of the coat, stirred recognition that transcended rational explanation. He didn't mention the sighting to anyone, not even Eleanor. Some experiences weren't meant to be analyzed or documented, only held in the heart as private affirmations that the world functioned in ways more mysterious and interconnected than humans could fully comprehend. Whether it was truly Mara checking the boundaries of her expanded territory, or simply another bobcat going about its wild business, the moment reinforced what Thomas had learned through all the months of unexpected partnership with the natural world. Life persisted. Adaptation was possible. And sometimes the most profound connections came from reaching across divides that seemed impossible to bridge, between wild and tame, between taking and giving, between desperation and hope. In helping Mara and her cubs find their way back to the wilderness where they belonged, Thomas had found his own way back to the core purpose that had drawn him to farming in the first place. Not just to take from the land, but to participate in its cycles of renewal and resilience, to be a steward rather than merely a harvester. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, Thomas and Eleanor sat on their porch, the peaceful ritual that bookended their days now infused with deeper appreciation for the world around them. No words were needed between them, their shared journey through drought and discovery having forged an understanding that transcended language. Somewhere in the growing darkness, a bobcat called, that distinctive yowl that carried through the night air like a reminder of wildness persisting alongside human endeavor. Thomas smiled, listening to the sound not as an intrusion, but as a harmony, the counterpoint to human existence that made the whole symphony of life on Earth complete.